I wanted to take a minute and respond to some concerns I've gotten from Christian viewers, saying things along the lines of, Marissa, why are you critiquing other Christians? Why are you tearing them down? These people who meant good for Christian families, have you gone to these teachers one-on-one? What about Matthew 18? Repent, things like this. And so I want to respond to those concerns, and let's start with Matthew 18. First of all, the context for Matthew 18 is a context of a local public assembly, people who know each other personally, who have offended one another. That is not what's going on in publicly critiquing public information that's been disseminated broadly by Christian teachers. So we've talked before about the problems with saying like, well, what's the biblical response to something? Simply because the vast majority of the Bible is narrative, it's truth already applied, from which we can extract principles to apply to current scenarios. But it's not really an instruction manual where we can look up what do I do when I disagree with Christian parenting experts or something like this. So we can look for relevant principles, and we do find some in the Acts of the Apostles, which is going to describe what the early church was doing, as well as the epistles, which are going to give some prescriptive instructions. Because, of course, the early church needed to deal with problematic teaching. We see this in the narrative. We also see it in the instructions. Almost every epistle has cautions and warnings against problematic teaching. And you can imagine why. So first, let's consider the context of the early church. This is a group of believers developing when Christians are scattered throughout the Roman polytheistic pagan empire. Some of them may have been eyewitnesses. They may have been followers of Jesus, and they're telling what they saw and what they witnessed and what they experienced with him. Others would have come to faith later through that testimony or through teaching of missionary apostles who are traveling from community to community and teaching about Jesus. But then they move on. So you have these little groups of believers coming from wildly diverse backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, disrupting all the usual social order. You have Jewish believers and Gentile believers trying to figure out how to be in a community of faith together. The very first church council needed to deal with that because there was so much chaotic teaching around that. So yes, there has always been problematic teaching through every generation of church history, and Christians have always needed to address it. And they've done this in a myriad of ways. You see this in the biblical narrative. So I'm going to use the term problematic teaching to refer to this because that's a nice umbrella that just covers a lot of territory. Because you have, people outside the church who don't claim Christianity, who are opposing the church, who are trying to attack it. You have people within the church who are malicious. You have people who want to profit, who are greedy for gain. You have people who just are enemies of the apostles, who don't like them, who are jealous of them, who are trying to poach followers. You also have people with incomplete or inaccurate knowledge, like well-intentioned people who just are not informed properly or who made errors. You also have just general conflict, believers disagreeing with one another, and it's causing division and concerns. So this is not meant to be comprehensive, but that should give you an idea about the different categories at play. And so we see a wide range of responses, right? When Peter kind of walks back the unity Jewish and Gentile Christians have with one another and, is like, I'm not going to eat with Gentile Christians anymore. Paul confronts him to his face publicly and writes about it so that the church for centuries knows about this. And that's what you'll see when the integrity of the gospel message is at stake. The apostles are going to wham right there publicly, no holding back, because the implications of problematic teaching taking hold are so significant. We also see this in the epistles of Peter and Jude. They use very strong words because the stakes are so high with the malicious, problematic teachers infiltrating these vulnerable communities. So they are very strong in their critiques. Other places, I'm thinking of Paul's epistle to the Philippians, Paul does not address, he names that there are people preaching Christ for selfish gain, for wrong motives, out of jealousy. And he's content to kind of leave it because Christ is being preached. So in that example, he's not addressing it because the message is still sound. It's rare that you see apostles and early church leaders actually engaging malicious, problematic teachers directly. Much more frequently, they are offering instruction to the communities entrusted to their spiritual care. And we see Paul exhort Timothy to do this. Timothy likely was in Ephesus, which was just riven by controversies and quarrels and disputes and arguments. And this is Paul's approach for Timothy. He says, have nothing to do with it. Don't get entangled in all that argument with all the people arguing. Instead, you preach sound doctrine. The antidote to the problematic teaching isn't to try and prove it wrong as much as to build up the good and nourishing and true. And other places, people are warned to not engage problematic teachers at all. In John's epistle, he does that. He says, don't even eat with them, lest you maybe lend credibility. And there are other places where the apostles say, avoid quarrelsome people. But you also have narrative moments where the apostles are going and engaging debate in public spaces to try and win people over. So I'm thinking of Apollos, you also have examples of people who had inaccurate or incomplete information, well-intentioned people. Apollos was teaching about Jesus accurately, but he only knew the baptism of John. So Priscilla and Aquila pull him aside. They teach him the way of God more accurately. Then he's able to move forward and continue in his teaching ministry. And later, Paul comes along and kind of helps repair the impact of that inaccurate information. And you have conflicts. This happens with Euodia and Syntyche in the church at Philippi. They had such a strong disagreement that Paul writes to the whole church to kind of help them resolve it. We know Paul and Barnabas had a strong disagreement. So there's also just general conflict within the church, sometimes so sharply that Paul and Barnabas were planning their missionary reunion tour. They had been co-laborers through all kinds of difficult circumstances for months and months and months, and they part ways so sharply. So there's not one way that you can say, well, if you're going to address problematic Christian parenting teaching, here's the one way. The thing I feel pretty confident about, having looked into this, I was working on an article about how we see this in the New Testament addressed earlier this summer, is that it was addressed. The one thing we don't have is the luxury to leave it be, especially when it will continue to impact Christians and impact their understanding, especially teaching that's out of step with the gospel. Now, we also have teaching that would remind us to be careful with our tongues. James has a lot to say about this. There is no excuse for Christians to tear one another down. These are people for whom Christ died, and our words should reflect that. But that does not mean we shy away from critique or criticism or pointing out flaws. And with Christian parenting teaching, I mean, at best, you have fellow Christians who have inaccurate or incomplete teaching, or teaching that is just their opinion that they've equated with a level of spiritual authority that is not granted them. And James has words that caution many of us from being teachers because of this. Teachers are subject to greater scrutiny. That's sort of just a general principle, and also a sobering reminder to those who would position themselves as experts. Now, what we don't see a lot of early Christians doing is directly confronting dangerous people themselves. In fact, the apostles had good boundaries. They left a place when people were dangerous or harmful. I feel zero compulsion to seek out one-on-one engagement, particularly with Christian parenting experts who have taught such damaging things. My purpose is not to try and convince them, but to address the teaching itself for the benefit of those who hear.